Hi, I hope you're all having a good week. This upcoming week, we have Heather Montgomery joining us during class, and she's going to be talking about the Working Center and some of her work in community engagement. I expect she's going to take a fair bit of class time, if not all of it. So I wanted to make sure that we took a moment to talk about the readings in a separate format. So I'm going to include and upload a brief discussion around Stone and Duke's theological interpretation and reflection, and do a little very short crash course theology discussion. So I'm just going to call up the slideshow. So this week we're talking about theological reflection, and ultimately theological reflection is faith-seeking understanding, this attempt to make sense of our world through the lens of faith. It's a cornerstone of this course, and in fact, it's a cornerstone of many of the courses at Luther. But theological reflection is something that's always evolving. It's not something that after one class or even one course we'll all have down pat. It's something that we continue to refine and engage as we live our lives. But ultimately, it helps us make sense of our lives and faith through the lens of theology. Theology here meaning that systematic study of faith that allows us to explore the full human experience through the lens of faith. Bearing in mind that while this course focuses largely on the Christian tradition, I want to stop and acknowledge and honor that faith, there are, of course, many faith traditions. And so while I'm talking about the Christian tradition in this very short slideshow, there will be others who are engaging in theological reflection through the embrace of their own holy scriptures, their own holy book, and their own traditions. Stone and Duke talk about two different types of theological reflection. The first is embedded theology, or the theology that informs our daily living through what we've learned through church, tradition, family, community, and so on. And this can inform deliberative theology. And in fact, I find that many of the theological questions and theological reflection tasks that I engage start with my own embedded theology. Well, why do I think this? Deliberative theology basically is taking our understanding or our questions around faith, putting it under a lens, and spending more time critically exploring it, that careful reflection. I want to take a moment and also just note the definition of theodicy because it's something that Stone and Duke briefly discuss. I'm going to put a short video up on my learning space because I think it's very helpful. Theodicy is an argument or a rationalization that's offered to defend God against evil and tragedy in the world. And theodicies allow us to believe in a good and powerful God despite great suffering in a broken world. I think the reason it's good that we understand what a theodicy is because as we engage in this exploration of global civilization, social justice, and so on, we're coming face to face with suffering in the world. And so it's good to have this understanding of what a theodicy is. So, for example, a theodicy might be suffering makes us stronger, that God gives us suffering to strengthen faith, and so on. These are theodicies. They rationalize suffering and defend God rather than labeling them as legitimate suffering, evil, and tragedy. So I'll put this video up. I think it's a helpful thing to understand. So one of the first things that I think we need to acknowledge when we're engaging in theological reflection is the sense of, or the definition of, what is your template? You need to define the template that you are using as you engage in theological reflection. So for many, it might be a faith tradition, Christianity or otherwise. But for some, it may be secular humanism, a moral compass that is happening outside of a faith tradition and is informed by other sources. So that is something you're going to want to identify as you engage in the reflection and the reflective exercises throughout this course. And just to share, the image is actually a mind map that I was working on when writing my dissertation. So that was an attempt at a template. Stone and Duke talk about the Wesleyan quadrilateral, though they refer to it as the Methodist quadrilateral. And that tells us that reflection is informed by four different sources: tradition, experience, scripture, and reason. I want to take a few minutes and talk in detail about scripture because it's helpful given that we will be reading scripture as the course progresses. There are two different types of interpretation when we discuss scripture, and Stone and Duke again talk about them. The first that I want to talk about is exegesis, which is an interpretive exercise where a biblical text is critically analyzed by employing very specific analytical strategies. We're not going to talk about these analytical strategies. There are many, and biblical scholars them engage them quite rigorously. But ultimately, it helps us learn to read from the Bible rather than reading into or onto the Bible, which is eisegesis. Eisegesis means that your biblical interpretation is one where you're imposing your interpretation on the text. So rather than asking, what is the Bible telling me? You are taking your tradition, your interpretive lens, and imposing it on the Bible. And just a word on tradition, we're going to talk about that in a moment. Tradition can be a rich and valuable resource, but can also be problematic. So we're going to emphasize an exegetical analysis in our interpretation or our hermeneutical approach to the Bible. I do want to bear in mind that any reading of the Bible is both a scholarly activity, but also a journey of faith. And we need to hold both of those sort of in this tension, but also a place of respect as we sort of continue with this discussion of the Bible. I do want to honor that the Bible and any biblical reading is very much an experience of faith for many people. And so we need to be sensitive. Exegetical analysis considers many things if we're considering what the Bible is telling us. We need to remember that the Bible isn't just a book of one author that was handed down to us, though some people believe that. We need to be careful that it is ultimately authored by God. But the Bible we know is a multi-authored, multi-generational, multi-tradition, multi-edition, essentially, book, that it has been written by many authors over centuries, by many traditions. And when I say multi-edition, what I'm saying is that we don't actually have access to the first however many editions of the Bible. We are reading later copies of the Bible. And every time, of course, the Bible was reproduced, whoever reproduced it, the editor, the scribe, would impose their own interpretive lens based on how they translated it or the words they used or didn't use. We need to remember that the Bible was written in ancient languages that very few of us read, Hebrew or Aramaic. And we need to remember that it embraces many literary forms and unique forms of grammar. So in the Bible, we're reading hymns and parables and poetry and genealogies and directives, letters, and so on. And each of those has a specific intent and purpose. And we need to remember that when we're reading the Bible. What was this passage doing in the moment? And how does that help us understand the passage? We also need to remember that the Bible was written in a very specific socio-political and historical context, and that even as the Bible progresses, those contexts change. So the world of the Old Testament is ultimately very different than the world of the New Testament. And we need to remember that many traditions inform the Bible, including oral traditions where we don't have access to written material. We simply know through careful analysis that an oral tradition informed the Bible. And to take a moment just to talk specifically about the Gospels, since these will be the books we're reading largely in this course. These are, again, a compilation of genealogies, hymns, poetry, stories, and so on. They're influenced by Jewish literature in that they were written for a Greco-Roman world that had access to the Old Testament, and the authors would have been influenced by the Old Testament. We need to remember that these stories about Jesus are ancient biographies. They are not the same as a modern biography, the way we might read something, say, about Winston Churchill. They were meant to share the story and the miracle of Jesus, and they were written as stories that were designed to draw us in, not to record precise historical details. And they are very evangelistic. And evangelistic means to tell the good news, to share the good news. These were written by a community that had embraced the stories of Jesus. And in fact, they were an early Jewish cult embracing this Christian tradition. We need to remember that these were Jewish writers. The Synoptic Gospels, I just want to take a moment and talk about, and again, there are entire courses on this, so this is the tip of the iceberg. The Synoptic Gospels are Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and these were written essentially with overlapping content. So synoptic means seeing them together. They share often similar accounts of Jesus's birth, life, death, and ministry. And ultimately, these authors weren't starting from scratch, but were narrating from traditions and material they had access to, including oral tradition and oral stories that would have been handed down from person to person to person. We also need to remember that we only have access to some of the Gospels. We have learned over time that there were other Gospels that were written but were not included because the early church or early editors did not see fit to include them. So, for example, during my studies, I read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, but of course that's not in the Bible. But what about John, you ask? It's one of the Gospels. Most scholars think that the Gospel of John was a later addition that didn't emerge until later on in the development of the Gospels. 90% of the content is actually material we don't see in the other three Gospels. And it emphasizes Jesus as the true revelation of God. So that this is a product of a Christian sect that had limited contact with these other Christian sects that had access to all of this other material, including the oral tradition. So this is a gospel that was written perhaps separately. So leaving scripture behind, because that's one thing that informs theological reflection, I want to highlight the other three, and that is tradition. So these would be the passage of ideas, beliefs, and practices from one generation to another. And they can be formal traditions that we see in church in the form of baptism and other forms of rituals we engage, but in some cases they can be informal as well. And I need to acknowledge that these can be both deeply enriching and can inform our faith, but they can also be destructive or problematic. So, for example, the tradition of excluding women in particular forms of church life in some Christian traditions. This can be deeply hurtful, or the tradition of identifying God with a male figure for people who perhaps have been abused, particularly family abuse, domestic violence. The image of God as father or God as male can be problematic. Reason. So this idea that our engagement with the Bible is still a reasoned exercise. And while theologians have tried to apply logic or scientific method or other forms of rigorous scrutiny over the years, they often don't work particularly well, because reading the Bible is both an exercise, a scholarly exercise, as I said, but also a journey of faith. Ultimately, I liked what Stone and Duke highlighted, and that is we want our engagement with the Bible or with faith or with theological reflection to be clear, coherent, and well-informed. We want it to be something we're critically engaging in. And finally, this idea of experience. And experience I want to honor as being an important contribution to our theological reflection, and considering what about our life journey in fact impacts our faith, belief, and practices. So ultimately, when we're engaging in theological reflection over the course, I want you to do a few things. I want you to figure out what your template is. Are you approaching this from a Christian tradition or from some other location? How do the scripture, the texts, the tradition, reason, faith, etc., impact your interpretation of whatever you're grappling with? If you're not working with the Bible, if you're engaging with other holy texts, please tell me. Identify what questions you're trying to think through and what emerges from your theological reflection, that critical understanding and exploration of your journey. What questions emerge? And then how do you further unpack and explore those questions? Perhaps you need to consult new material, revisit old material, or engage in some other exercise that will help you further your thinking, with the idea being that in all of this, new learning, understanding, and insight will emerge. Thanks so much, and I look forward to our conversation on Monday.